Hello and welcome to the remote Kelly Writer's House. I'm Davy Knittle. I'm the curator of City Planning Poetics, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to City Planning Poetics 9, Feeling the City, with Akira Drake Rodriguez and Jill MAGI. So before we start, I wanted to go ahead and thank Heidi Kalu, Jessica Lowenthal, Zach Gardner, and Ali Katz for making this event happen. Every event at the Kelly Writers House is a community effort. Lots of folks work to make it happen. And every event at the remote Kelly Writers House is more of a community effort. So many of the folks who you literally physically cannot see have done tons and tons of work to make this event possible. This event was originally meant to happen in the physical Kelly Writers House in March and got postponed to now. And so I especially wanted to thank Akira and Jill for being willing to have this event in the remote format. And so the way the format of this event will work is that I'll offer a long introduction to their work. And if you're watching on the YouTube feed, a link to the text of that introduction is available in the description. So if you want to follow along, it's the exact text that I'm reading in case you want to reread a sentence or have their work in front of you as I'm describing it. And we'll have 15-minute presentations or readings from Jill and then from Akira. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, aiming to finish between 7:15 and 7:30 Philadelphia time. If you have a question at any point during the event, before the Q&A, during the Q&A, go ahead and put it in the YouTube chat, and then it will be conveyed over to us. And we'll be able to put it to Akira and Jill to answer your question. Thank you so much for attending this event. I'm really looking forward to it. So in her 2011 monograph, Cruel Optimism, affect theorist Lauren Berlant argues structure of an optimistic attachment involves a sustaining inclination to return to the scene of fantasy that enables you to expect that this time nearness to this thing will help you or a world to become different in just the right way. But optimism is cruel when the object seen that ignites a sense of possibility actually makes it impossible to attain the expansive transformation for which a person or people risks striving. In Berlant's framing, optimism entails the belief that desirable change is possible. Optimism, as Berlant describes it, is implicitly a relation not to whether the circumstances of the present will change, but to how they will change. What distinguishes a cruel optimism is that a desirable and sustaining idea of change itself ensures that the change you long for will never arrive. If we're thinking about optimism, then we're thinking in terms of affect, what the Oxford English Dictionary describes as a feeling or subjective experience accompanying a thought or action occurring in a response to a stimulus, an emotion, a mood. Following Berlant, the reason we would think in terms of affect is because, as Berlant suggests, the present is perceived first affectively. To describe the conditions of the present is to describe how the present feels and the systems, procedures, and conditions that produce that feeling. The subject of this 9th iteration of City Planning Poetics is feeling the city. If we follow Berlant, then how the present feels shapes how we might describe or analyze it. If our capacity for description is shaped by how we feel as we describe, then how did the present conditions of the built, social, and environmental context of urban space in which many of us live determine and guide our descriptions? What kinds of optimism characterize the acts of perception, documentation, and planning that make up the present and future conditions of urban space? What do we learn about what cities are by describing the affects that shape their present? How is the way that urban spaces feel to various residents conditioned by legacies and ongoing practices of racialized and uneven social and political disinvestment and devaluation? How can affective orientations to urban space themselves be catalysts for urban change? Both planning historian Akira Drake Rodriguez and poet Jill MAGI are concerned with the relationship between the forms of change possible in cities and the relation between how cities feel and how they have felt in the past. In Rodriguez's forthcoming monograph, Diverging Space for Deviance, The Politics of Atlanta's Public Housing, she offers an analysis of 20th century tenant activism in Atlanta's public housing system. Rodriguez pays particular attention to the role of Black women in advocacy for public housing tenants' rights as a politically divergent form of urban participation. Rodriguez describes how the members of the tenant association of the oldest public housing development in the US framed their affective experience of where they lived as an element of their demand for its modernization. As Atlanta's Techwood and Clark Howell Homes Tenant Association identified in a 1980 statement issued to Atlanta's Public Housing Authority, quote, modernization and improvement should aim to inspire pride and satisfaction in the living environment and a feeling that someone cares, rather than to reinforce and perpetuate hostilities and antagonism. In the statement, how the housing development feels to its residents is a direct result of racialized disinvestment perpetuated by Atlanta's Public Housing Authority. As Rodriguez notes, the modernization statement explicitly addresses what residents consider to be the problem, an underdeveloped community planned by everyone but its residents. She goes on to argue that, quote, while politicians were increasing police budgets and using the logics of defensible space to transform cities into bifurcated spaces of privatized affluent leisure and marginalized public surveillance, public housing residents were advocating for improved infrastructure, economic development, and a built environment that was both safe and welcoming to outsiders. Evident in Rodriguez's analysis is that how the city felt to the members of the Techwood and Clark Howell Homes Tenant Association was shaped by legacies of racialized disinvestment in Atlanta. How the city feels is, as Rodriguez explains, a guide to racialized histories of power and policy in Atlanta's public housing system, as well as to motivation for its transformation. In Rodriguez's framing, it becomes clear that optimistic attachments to urban spaces, in the form of the desire for them to be safe or welcoming, are themselves affective relations. They are motivated by ideas of urban change dictated by how the city feels and how it might come to feel as it is transformed. They are motivated too by implicit and explicit arguments about who has a right to feel safe or welcomed by their city and what would facilitate those feelings for different individuals and communities. The members of the Tenants Association argue not only that they have a right to certain material resources, but also that they have a right to, quote, a feeling that someone cares. Their advocacy for change is in an effort to curate how the city feels to their fellow residents and to identify positive affective relationships to urban space as themselves a right mediated by political forces. In her 2019 collection Speech, Jill MAGI similarly traces the contours of racial capitalism as the context through which the subject of her long poem Outpost/Blank moves. In the poem, MAGI writes, as the American Medical Association fatally weakened the drive for socialized medicine by 1949, she locked the second lock of her door. As the attempt to revive the Fair Employment Practices Commission was defeated, she went downstairs and crossed the street. As Citibank lobbied for legislation to end Depression-era banking reforms and won, she stepped up over the curb. As in the case of the residents of Atlanta's public housing system in the early 1980s, the subject's movement through the city is structured by the weight and behavior of the major engines of global capitalism, which MAGI sutures to her subject's quotidian activities. In her afterword to Speech, entitled Postscript, A Third Space, MAGI additionally reflects on daily life in urban space as she writes, quote, two cities of middles overlapped inside my notebook. This was confusing, though I was not unhappy, until heat rose up in me and I went from asking, where should I live, to thinking, here I have something to learn, which was to believe in poetry's making despite the misrecognition, quote, poet equals citizen, as if a poet could only be real through official belonging. In fact, it had always been the opposite. As is the case for the subject of Outpost/Blank, MAGI works in the postscript to disaggregate the invitation to a cruel optimism about positive transformation in the context of global racial capitalism, to make another observation entirely, to note that here I have something to learn. She pivots from speculating about the future of individual cities to speculating about a present formed over previous and current experiences of urban space that overlap. In a February 2020 essay on the collection, MAGI notes that speech is set in lines that mimic the pace of walking and the repeated movement of a weaver's shuttle. The composite voice, in an attempt to make place, explores ideological middles between citizen and migrant, history and the present, here and there, freedom and constraint, speaking and silence. The composite city of the poems, part Abu Dhabi, where MAGI lives, and part Chicago, and how it feels is inextricable from the situated experience of moving through it. We, all of us, share and can meet on the plane in which the built environment of urban and non-urban spaces is inextricable from our affective responses to those spaces that make up the present. We can meet here even as we diverge from one another in our experiences of what those affects and spaces are, and our perceptions and misperceptions of which ones we share and which ones we don't. On its surface, this is a simple idea, that cities are in part how we feel about them. Within it is another simple idea, that inequitable urban change is directly related to biased valuations of whose feelings matter to the present and future of a given urban space. As the precise and expansive toolkit of both Rodriguez's and MAGI's work indicates, the implications of these facially straightforward ideas are both tremendously difficult and essential to map and to describe. If the aim of an optimistic attachment to a given urban space is to understand what it means to be attached to a city, to love a city, to feel that you know a city, is that a cruel optimism? Is the complexity of urban spaces, which escape from us and exceed our perception even as we live in them and move through them, a barrier to an optimism about how they might change to be more equitable? If cities occur at the intersection of the built environment and the affect that Berlant argues is the texture of the present, then what tools do we need to adequately represent any urban space in our experience of it? Should how cities feel be external to questions about urban policy and planning? If the feeling of cities should be a part of those questions, what language to describe the feeling of cities would make its importance clear to people unaccustomed to thinking about cities in terms of affect? Reading and imminently hearing from Rodriguez and MAGI in conversation, perhaps those tools exist in the diffusion and overlap between the strategies of poetry and those of planning history to be precise about what cities are by being precise about how they feel. In that precision, there is perhaps a strategy for guiding small and large forms of urban transformation. Based in the UAE and Vermont, USA, Jill MAGI works in text, image, and textile. The author of 6 books of poetry and numerous handmade books housed in the University at Buffalo Poetry Collection, Jill ran Sona Books for 10 years, publishing chapbooks of experimental works that she described as risky, quiet, and community-based. Her most recent book, Speech, Nightboat 2019, is set in a city of middles, something like the Middle East and something like the Midwest, and the fictional wanderer who navigates these places resides in a female body of middle age. Jill has had residencies with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and the Brooklyn Textile Arts Center, and has taught for more than 20 years at research universities, liberal arts colleges, and MFA and BFA programs and community-based adult literacy programs. Jill has also had solo exhibitions of visual work at the NYU Abu Dhabi Project Space Gallery, Tashkeel, and Gray Noise, and is a co-founder of JARA Collective. Akira Drake Rodriguez is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School and the Department of City and Regional Planning. Her research examines the politics of urban planning, or the ways that disenfranchised groups reappropriate their marginalized spaces in the city to gain access to and sustain urban political power. Dr. Rodriguez's forthcoming manuscript, Diverging Space for Deviance, The Politics of Atlanta's Public Housing, University of Georgia Press 2021, explores how the politics of public housing planning and race in Atlanta created a politics of resistance within its public housing developments. This research offers the alternative benefits of public housing outside of shelter provision to challenge the overwhelming narrative of public housing as a dysfunctional relic of the welfare state. Dr. Rodriguez was recently awarded a Spencer Foundation grant to study how parent and educational advocates mobilize around school facility planning processes in Philadelphia. It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome Jill and Akira to the virtual Kelly Writers House.
Thank you, Davy, so much for that introduction and framing. And Akira, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you in our conversation. And thank you, everybody else who's tuning in from other places. So I'll read from Speech, and I'll actually read from the section that Davy quoted, outpost/blank. And this section begins with a quote from Neha Vora from her book, Impossible Citizens, Dubai's Indian Diaspora. Quote, I propose an approach to studying citizenship and belonging that attends to the circulation and practice of multiple forms of governance in contemporary nation states. This approach avoids exceptionalizing particular parts of the world and instead acknowledges that globally and locally circulating vocabularies of economy, belonging, and rights are assembled, disassembled, and reassembled everywhere. This approach does not disavow the specificities of different contexts, but rather resists thinking of them as anomalous, spectacular, or pathological. End quote. Is this version of city to cross your outpost? A light blue gauze, a desert skin, a thick gray fog, a south side, a red line. Is your outpost this comfort version, your heart tent, your lopsided outpost, a crowded kitchen, a blocked window blocked by too many beds, stacked for rent? Is your north crossing your south? Dis. Is your outpost a scratch on this scene, or the Tuareg who guide you through for your trust, or an architect who guides a tour of paychecks encroaching? Dis. Who do not talk to the intolerance of heat, the intolerance of votes for segregation, to tolerate the weekend death toll? Dis. Who talks to the cardinal other, the cardinal north in notebooks thorned, saying, come, be a better parent, or wash up your answers, wash up your pavement. Your outpost eye cross-hatching, looking at who gets back on the train, gets back behind the gate, who wishes the fence taller, wishes interpretation flailing, who stays away from you, who would be the we of equal? Dis. Who watches fireworks rocketing or pay stubs falling, glossing the memory of bombs, of fires set for profit? We, pitching a tent at the start of the story, shuffling money at the exchange counter, the men transacting in pairs to better the chances of language success, or buying electric toys cheaply for children elsewhere home. We, apart, sending the tale that travels, that maps a showcase that we are not here or there, but trust that everywhere is a property, is a literature, a territory. So she asks, how comfortable are you with indigo billowing in a desert, who navigates you through for a price? He knows the waterway and draws the blinds down, draws down the veil, where if local is not a citizen, if I walk past, not the victim. And the sharp speech in not conversing, the sharp of not agreeing to be known, collapses the tent of betterment, of constitutional textbook disrepresentation, a legal disfiction. For if time and learning buy my ethics, or if a theory blankets a body with a concept versus experience lived, under siege or flood, a figure of them makes a figure of rights. Then to go home and allow your wife, we agree. To go home and disrobe your wife, we agree. To go home and vote for your wife, we agree. But a seminar for the needy elite, dis. Who make so much we don't see, dis. Who make so much, so many deals, dis. To extract for progeny, dis. Good mother, good father, literate, living long and well, but never to read the ghosts they make, called swim or sink and shrug. Do they know who me? Is my sovereignty linked to you representing me? Do I think about sovereignty as I walk, as I write? Am I free with my body or the state? And so in which city did she go as her speech could no longer complete, as poetry stops and starts? As through the alley, a sliver of car is seen, a sliver of not citizens seen in the blue paint of the sky above, seen in the tier of memorial brick, in white plaster against the black of shadows and grace, a city of shadows and grace, saying, if the first tea is bitter as death, the second tea mild as life, the third tea sweet as love. And if lightly your vectors line up over a bypass zone is love, where lightly sands distribute a border smudge is love. For no idea is too stealth for wind, where the earth is so flat. For as a border does not touch the ground, your speaking is love. If she deeply laughs along and brings back fruit sweetened in the sun is love. If they wade out into waters clear, and if the gift is the relentless possibility of the impossible, then you bathe in a philosophical situation where to clarify the fundamental choices of thought, where to clarify the distance between thought and power and rest on that word power, where to clarify the value of rupture, we agree. And so rupture may be the ambivalent speech of freedom given, or the sure speech of freedom purchased, and rupturing the sky she left from and never fit inside a freedom feeling there. She walks where the subject is not acting, is not an event or muscle, but is sympathetic to the sphere of passion, of suffering, of patience, of relation, is susceptible instead of immune. As here the slant-built places of worship, where impossible citizen does not stop walking, but folds impossible glimpses inside. Not fully seen speaking here joins the unfolding, pushing air up out through enormous fans. She, not the ultimate suffering stranger, she, not a threat to the national order of things. And as treated window glass reveals management lines to order the faithful in equality rows, she walks through a broadcast, through veins not home, as light glows a niche followed by a tree, not east or west, as light doubles light, impossible citizen lands a job in a place eaten up by origins, where the horizon of who is who clears, keeps place, where they do not send speech out down the line. Not having their language, though they had hers, she kept place, built a ceiling below the ceiling, a door in front of the door, a window in front of the window, to the sky, the hawk, a visitor, to the silence of her desk. She spoke in the vestibule preceding the vestibule, the door behind the door, opening up time to think. Not in the gray of a melancholy film, not the impossibility of language or a book of lack, but to think in ripening red without speech. A change before a change. She felt the future of history forming a cell wall attachment as city inside the city, its cloud of secret perfume cresting as black chiffon went walking, as suits filled with concrete pressed forward, as uniforms parked their lookout. An impossible citizen does not ask, but following them traces previous beliefs, as another wears the same fabric, but minus crystal flourishes, lighting the hem, so tiny a detail lightnings her status under them. Under great leaders projected on office towers, or leaders in hard hats below, beaming down flags that brush away dust, a flag inside the flag, a film of dust, over leaders in rows, in storms of cameras. She paused, remembering how they create the below and who must learn to love. So she saw the lens of the near antonym of to learn, so insignificant she grew in the year the dust lady, pictured famous as pathos, dies, as the economy inside the economy of no nets, of no health, brews a storm of shame on shame for what her country had, is doing. So should she broadcast her crystal tipping point, broadcast piece over piece as a metal box inside the box locked the elastic truth? She placed the floor over the floor, went with others walking to the market, unimpeded by a slip at the intersection. As the street interlaced the people of whom she was seen by and spoken into languages luminous as bells, as the clock beneath the clock told the time to turn decisions over, turn over every normal right belief, underwriting belief, to wake up knowing abnormal coordinates formed her own intersection until sunset, she, facing east, facing speech, waking up after wake up America, and somebody blew up America, its map over the map, the true of the diagonal across the south of the north. Could this public script speak as weight drains, as sand rushes out of pinholes from her back, pillowing high above streets, above secret deals, she realigns her gravity, her supposed to, floats, words, where a flush of speech would, where speech mixed with silence would. Dear Union sisters and brothers, not this solidarity speech, where if I am not him, then I do not deserve my happiness is a whiteness speech, an exoneration attempt, where what is free or not conducts through wires, dangling or digging below to place a public inside a public, wrapping wires around wires like indigo patterns tied off with string from elsewhere, as here wraps tiny bundles around there, and there is a fibril twining braid as space between space is when you know you do not know all of what the Central Intelligence Agency has done in order to slant a staircase that leads up into a marble wall of belief and back down. The staircase binding what she could see to what she could not afford. And as her heat rose, she stepped out next to herself. As the American Medical Association fatally weakened the drive for socialized medicine by 1949, she locked the second lock of her door. As the attempt to revive the Fair Employment Practices Commission was defeated, she went downstairs and crossed the street. As Citibank lobbied for legislation to end Depression-era banking reforms and won, she stepped up over the curb. As COINTELPRO dismantled the Black Panther Party, she lined up at the stoplight. As the CIO expelled 11 left-led industrial unions in 1949, she paused at the door that led to, as the federal government denied Marcus Garvey's UNIA a postal permit, she slipped into the revolving door of the, as Dr. King described a lonely island of poverty in the same speech as I Have a Dream, she made her way through the vestibule. As Rosa Parks trained at the Highlander Folk School and Septima Clark ran a workshop on social needs and social resources, she put her card in the slot. As the Patriot Act was easily passed, she punched in numbers on the private keypad, and as the first Pan-African conference on reparations was held, she waited for what she called hers. And the list of who was shot, the list of who shot, came to her over the air as the list of drones, as the list of successful statistics of hungers, as the list of states of wars not so named, as the air inside air delivered news, as the news could not discern what war from what peace. An impossible citizen mirrors the former place with a present, until she stops her backward look ticket. Until one day, how clear the air, as new heat, as old haunts send history up her spine, twisting as vines, she kept place, sending figures away with the others, in the air pressing transfer over an ocean or more. As they climbed the curb, as the pavement sank, as the West pushed up out of her head, everyone seeing the snake breaking open democracy. So it was never your freedom idea, such a fragile skull, ceramic cracking with every them, with every heavy axe of individuality. The community cuts, we agree. The community mandates a training session on death, we agree. The community has its own mind and a ladder to a leader, we agree. And these are not extra thoughts like hair shorn off for sale, like groups of men carrying new blankets for shipments home. Not extra, like the boy crying, wanting new sneakers, a mother grabbing him, shaking nothing extra out. Nothing extra is not private. As the microphone clips, as the remote signals remote power, while the place for washing clean attaches to the slant clearly. So, further into indigo, she paused before the decay, the smell of death holding border patterns intricately. Holding her blue was no home inside her country. As the refugee is made by universal liberty, as the refugee is made red, as a refugee makes her father a feather shaking, the tether of foreign making the code of local, as flecks of seeds in her throat, as her country and its heat rose from green waters, cloth dipping its heavy shoulders into the vat. Such was her skin of not knowing and knowing, opening and stirring her suitcase of privilege while she over distance spoke. I feel close to lost. While the seeds to seal the color grew next to the plant used for dyeing, she learned this comfort plan, complete blueprint, as the motor of night brought thin promises of slight sleep possible. Inside her sleep, as cloth, as skin pulled up out of the water, she, heavy with the oxygen of listening, of history, lifting up only to back down. On the pavement she crossed with an exhale, exposed to the light of her beliefs turning toward blue. Sailcloth, questions, kneeling, so this is beauty, kenning. Everyone sees who is who, wave traveler for refugee, wave traveler for patriot, scratch universal, scratch it, write fear over fear, stack table on top of table, desk underneath desk, and sit where to be is to sit, where the flick of a hand keeps some at bay, beckoning others from their tinted windows, from some who squat, from some who stand leaning against a fugitive pose, from a window that rolls up speaking with so many pointer fingers on a keyboard of elsewhere, making place along with she, where if she said home, this meant no citizenship. So with their status, they struck it, the screen around the screen, the profile snapshot laminated, cover sheet over sheet, and a shelf of books behind a shelf pulled apart by a zipper, a mouth of teeth, a mouth of teach. Who learned the shock of home stratification, the whitewashed layers of so much speech put into troughs, a satisfying feed for policy secretly to consign? That life is not divided into separate airtight compartments. This was said in a speech by the radical who lost, who knew the book inside the book as placenta apparatus, discarding the legible ethic only after the birth of the lie of easy rights for all. But if we cannot learn from one another what is right to think and feel and do, then conversation between us will be pointless, he wrote. Relativism of that sort is just a reason to fall silent, as gladly inside those givens she did. Feel the world as tiny particles, not speech, a vast ear. Women rose faintly, still rose. She stops and asks for bread from the oven for 2 coins. Networks melt into the act of placing cool coins into his hand. She barely thanks him. Light blue cuffs frame the contact of coin atop coin and the near contact of 2 sets of hands passing and receiving a plastic bag filled with warm bread. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. I've been thinking a lot about emotions for quite some time. And so I think also about how those emotions are really kind of used by planners implicitly and explicitly in shaping a lot of what the city looks like and how people sort of experience that city. Thinking about Jill's work, I was really sort of struck just now in the reading about these ideas of mobility. So the idea of how people move through the city was really, still remains really sort of the focus of a lot of my work in sort of the present, is thinking about how something like public housing in Atlanta, which is what I'll be talking about in this presentation, was meant to act as a space of mobility for a very sort of ignored, disenfranchised Black population in the city. And so that was not the case really ever for the program. It did allow for a certain proportion of Black residents to save money and move into private rental housing, but a lot of that available housing and available mobility was really structured by planners, but also structured by how people felt about Black people having that mobility. And I think the idea of Black mobility implicitly and explicitly shaped a lot of the things that we saw in Atlanta. We can see hard evidence in the reports from urban renewal and the reports from different policies to annex and make the city larger, that the city was very concerned about not only the growth of the Black population following the Great Migration from the 1920s, so about the 1970s, and even still with the reverse migration, but also the growing political power of this growing Black population. So this first slide is actually two images, the top and bottom of the city of Atlanta between the years 1960 and 1970, with the darkened areas indicating greater concentrations of Black residents. And you kind of see from the 60s to the 70s, an area where you have the Fair Housing Act and all of this policy that is supposed to be increasing opportunity and increasing mobility, increasing freedom, which is a critical feeling in the city, and instead just brought about more containment and more concentration in the following decade. So the first sort of feeling I want to talk about is fear. Early sort of placemaking in the city of Atlanta, before it was the city of Atlanta, it was land occupied by the Creek and Cherokee indigenous peoples. They were forcibly displaced from that land through a very sort of traditional campaign of first just plain old genocide, and then later sort of the use of the law, the use of the federal courts, and the use of the federal government as a middleman to sort of negotiate these small land exchanges and land parcels. Following the enslavement of African Americans to work that land, the land was soon transformed into the city of Atlanta following the expansion of the railroads. And so Atlanta becomes a growing city, and it soon becomes a city where a lot of emancipated African Americans and a lot of later on sort of rural migrants, both Black and white, flood into the city, creating a lot of tensions. Anytime there's a great migration, there are great tensions around housing, around public goods and services, around jobs. And so in these sort of tense times in 1906, in September in Atlanta, you have this race riot, you have the killing of innocent Negroes, and you have, as the headlines say, these sort of grim nights of terror in the southern city. And so the idea that at any point there could be this sort of racial violence was something that hung over in the South for a very long time. And so that feeling of fear, that inability to move, very much shaped where Black Atlantans traveled in the city. And so mobility was first constrained by these acts of racial violence that inspired the sort of self-segregation of African Americans into 4 or 5 communities in the city of Atlanta. Over the years, a program began to emerge to establish public housing through both slum clearance and the construction of low-cost housing that was subsidized by the federal government and sort of administrated and designed at the local level. And so public housing was very much something that was meant to address the concerns of the city. So it was meant to address fears of the city, fears of vice, fears of crime, but also fears of juvenile delinquency and fears of TB. So there was a lot of public health fears that came with slum clearance. But low cost housing construction, especially by the centralized federal government, particularly in the South, where you see strong resistance to any sort of federal intervention as sort of a hangover of the membership of the state in the Confederate States of America. They resisted federal intervention all the way through Brown v. Board. So they were very resistant to that oversight, and that resistance is part of the backlash initially against public housing. The idea that it would breed communism. This is a very common argument that you see across early public housing literature, that it would breed this sort of distaste and dislikes for the American way of life. However, there was also the sort of major campaign, particularly by city boosters, particularly other land and property owners in the downtown area that would receive a lot of this slum clearance and low-cost housing construction. The idea was that there was civic pride, both for the city, but also for the disenfranchised Black and poor white community. So although public housing is often billed as something that is for people, housing of the last resort, when the program first started, it was actually only going to serve a pretty small amount of the population based on the minimum and maximum income requirements, and the very extensive and lengthy application process that made it quite difficult for everyone to access. But for those who could, for sort of the deserving poor, it was very much about bringing health, beauty, and happiness. And so this idea of optimism and pride is something that has always existed around these public housing programs. Pride also came in the form of what was called then uplift politics and uplift ideology. The idea that it was up for elites and Black elites in particular to do what they can to uplift the bottom of the race so that the entire race was sort of lifted up towards social, economic, and political mobility. And so thinking about belonging and thinking about citizenship, public housing provided this opportunity for Black people to show that they could lead and they could lead successfully. And so Black leadership advisory committees, Black housing managers and housing staff, Black construction workers, all sort of oversaw and implemented and administered the first decade of the public housing program in Atlanta. In the 1930s and early 1940s, this was before Black people could vote entirely in the state of Georgia. They were only allowed to vote in sort of general elections because of the all-white Democratic primary that structured most of the electoral decisions in the majority Democrat state. And so this was, again, an opportunity to sort of create both the legitimacy of this leadership, but also, again, this idea of pride and the ability to create a sense of belonging in a city that had long benefited from Black labor. These feelings of pride extended into sort of a PR campaign. And so you see a lot of joy, you see a lot of pride, but you see that is very much an idea of sort of creating ideal role models for the Black community across the nation. And so photos such as the one here on the left of a tenant in one of the first Black public housing developments in the country, University Homes, giving a gift to the housing manager, again, one of the first Black housing managers in the country. Here we see housing managers pointing with Mayor William Hartsfield of Atlanta to some of the private homes that Black people were able to purchase after living in public housing. Here is the Black kitchen cabinet in President Roosevelt's administration during the New Deal, who were sort of tasked with making sure that Black people could also benefit from some of the New Deal programs. So while there have been many studies about how Black people were largely underserved and outright discriminated against from much of the welfare provided by the New Deal, there were certain opportunities that did provide feelings of belonging and did inspire pride and even feelings of patriotism. You'll see this in early letters and pamphlets from the first Black developments. As the populations began to change, these feelings of belonging became much rarer and led actually to feelings of isolation. And so as new populations came in after urban renewal, the population's demographics of public housing changed significantly to a greater dependency on welfare, more single women-headed households, and larger families and stays in public housing. And so public housing became more affordable at the same time that those large structural changes were shifting women's everyday moves. And so I was really also struck by that in Jill's work that, you know, these women are just living their lives trying to get, you know, their children to school and then try to go to work or look for a job. And the entire world is changing around them and they're unable to adjust. And so the vast structural changes in the political economy in the 1970s that pushed work way down south, way out of the cities, it made it really difficult for women to sort of maintain both steady work, but also maintain quality schools as schools were being desegregated. And so on multiple fronts, women are being sort of underserved by all of these institutions, and they become quite confrontational. They become quite angry. They say that we need to be protected from the Atlanta Housing Authority, as you see on this protest on the right, where women are protesting one of the public housing developments as being too infested with rats and vermin. Here on the left, we see women protesting in the actual management office of one of the public housing developments, Capitol Homes, to bring greater attention to their rent strike, which was not successful in sort of addressing the long-term and systemic needs of public housing. And so similarly, as women were becoming increasingly angry with the housing authority management, the managers were actually becoming quite distant and even partially repulsed by the conditions of public housing and the women who occupied those units in those conditions. There is also a lot of, I don't know really how to describe this feeling, but there is a lot of agency. So I can't really think of like what that emotion or that feeling is, but there is a great need to sort of use the political spaces of public housing, such as tenant associations and even just the planning meetings that were afforded and held in the actual developments. So on the lower bottom left, we have Mary Sanford, who is the head of Perry Homes Tenant Association for over 20 years. She's testifying at a MARTA hearing. So MARTA is the subway system in Atlanta, the Metro Atlanta Regional Transit Authority. As a result of Mary Sanford and many others, including the NAACP and some disability rights activists, they were able to sort of extend the MARTA line in this little spur here to Bankhead. If you recall the map from the first slide of Atlanta, you saw that large growing area of Black people concentrated in the Northwest, and you see that they're virtually unserved. And so these feelings of neglect, these feelings of isolation, these feelings of containment because of the lack of even basic mobility of just having, you know, the train service, one of the most heavily populated areas of the city, was just a long struggle. It actually didn't happen until, you know, the early 80s. And so you see this sort of neglect and isolation and containment that sort of emerges in the post-war city. Here is a list from the housing authorities, from the files of one of the public relation consultants that it hired in the early 1970s. There are many things on this list that are offensive, but the greatest offense to me is this idea of evicting undesirables. And so desire is something that comes up a lot in planning and thinking about the city as a playground, but thinking also about what uses and spaces and people are considered undesirable. And so you can see that in a lot of urban policy around people experiencing homelessness and people with contact in the carceral state. But there are certain behaviors and peoples that are not desired in the city. And so the idea that the housing authority was sort of constructing this difference within its tenants of who was desirable and who is undesirable is another thing that the housing authority sort of did to create greater tensions, but also to create new models of ideal tenants. There are also studies done about how different groups of residents felt. And so here are some surveys that were taken from around the 1970s about how different residents felt in the housing authority. The idea that the older residents did not like the militant behavior of the powerful young leaders. The idea that they are suspicious and fearful. And their main desire is safe, secure living quarters. In most cases, they live alone. And so this idea that, again, this is a desirable tenant, right? They don't have a lot of needs. They basically have a really sort of stable income, and they don't like the people who are causing trouble. And so this is, and thinking about belonging and thinking about citizenship, I think about how the housing authority kind of uses its own data to construct ideal and undesirable or less than ideal residents, and how that construction shapes how people sort of feel in those spaces. And so it becomes very obvious that looking at the tenant politics over time, that older residents are prioritized in tenant politics, and they often dictate how the development should feel, and what feelings are caused are generally generated by those older resident views. Younger residents, again, are just sort of disregarded as nuisances. They are more militant. They are responsible for a lot of vandalism, but generally they are frustrated, and that they create these problems. And so this idea of frustration as a feeling or anger is something that you'll also see in sort of different groups over time. And so beginning with that shift after urban renewal and the population, you start to see this shift between tenants who are kind of fearful and want to create a safe space, and tenants who are angry and want the state essentially to take care of them, to take better care of their units, and to fulfill their obligation as the landlord. It's also, this is data that was generated by the housing authority. There were older residents who were also quite militant and who were very aggressive and wanted to hold the state accountable. So it isn't this sort of clean bifurcation of how people feel according to age. In the 80s, the attention at the national level began to turn towards public housing as a problem and public housing residents as a problem. And again, thinking about it as an angry space, that they are human file cabinets set to explode. And so I was thinking of Jill's early reading about being crowded and stacked on top of each other. And sometimes that, density can be obviously really seen as a sign of luxury, right? So when we see these high rises, when they're full of people who don't have a lot of means, we consider them to be human file cabinets. But when they are full of people with means, and they're seen as, quality investment that is bringing the city back, that's creating kind of a more livable and thriving city, versus this sort of categorization of public housing as a human file cabinet set to explode. In the 80s, fear returns to public housing, in particular with the Atlanta child murders. And so on the left, we have images of men who were outside of public housing who were arrested for their bat patrol, which was sort of an outsiders implemented patrolling of public housing developments that had been the site of these Atlanta child abductions and later murders. And so the child murders were at least 30 victims who disappeared between the years 1979 and 1982. And a third of them were either found in or near public housing developments. And so it was very much a time of great fear. And this is multiple years when, you know, I would say after the first 2 months, the police really didn't do anything. And it took lots of mothers organizing to get the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and later the FBI to sort of open this task force and look into these disappearances because the city did not, again, extend that care to the residents of those human file cabinets. And so the disappearance of these youth who were, although it's called the Atlanta child murders, most of the victims range between 14 and 22. And some were quite old and just seen as truant or juvenile delinquents. And so because they were constructed not as victims, but as aggressors, there was no feeling, there was no empathy, and it took quite some time to generate that. But the mothers did do that. I really like to look at the organization STOP, which is the Committee to Stop Children's Murders, which really sought, the reason they're still kind of called the Atlanta child murders is because they did want to reclaim these children as children. Black childhood is a very sort of fraught moment where it is something that is not afforded, particularly to low-income Black children. The idea of innocence, of naivety, of exploration and joy, those are not emotions that are typically afforded to Black children. And so STOP was really committed to bringing childhood back into public housing. And so that feeling of innocence, that feeling of safety, they are really committed to working to bring that back. Finally, public housing ends kind of in fits and spurts over a series of about 30 years, starting with the when the city was awarded the Olympics in the year 1990. The Olympics took place in 1996, and demolition of the first sort of public housing, the Techwood homes that Davy mentioned in the introduction, was demolished. And so these group of protesters here, a lot of anger, a lot of feelings of betrayal, I think is probably the best way. And this sort of marks how public housing ended in Atlanta, was like a series of betrayals. People felt that the city was going to redevelop. And I think even the city thought that they would redevelop and renovate public housing instead of kind of demolish and diminish it. And so what ended up happening is that, at one point, 10% of Atlanta's population lived in public housing, 50,000 residents. That number, 10,000 units, that number is down to about 1,200 units, mostly elderly, of course. And so again, all of the housing was demolished. Not everyone cheered, right? So there were people who were happy to see public housing gone, but there's lots of trauma in these spaces. There were people who didn't want to move back because of the trauma they felt connected to those spaces. There were people who did want to move back and couldn't because of how they were constructed, whether that's having bad credit or having contact with the carceral state or being in a household with someone with that contact. And so there was, again, these feelings of exclusion, of not belonging, of betrayal, neglect, and isolation. New movements that emerge are with the sort of Occupy Our Homes Atlanta, which was in response to the foreclosure crisis. Again, just this extension of care, of support, of community for people that don't have that. And so without these formal tenant associations, without the close microgeographies of public housing developments, people are dispersed and scattered and without those feelings of belonging. I've been working with a couple of women who grew up in public housing and were displaced from public housing after it was demolished and moved maybe with a housing choice voucher, maybe not, into private rental housing, and kind of got displaced from those rental units as well as a result of gentrification efforts that began with the Olympics. And so their feeling is that they are, as they say, twice displaced. And they feel, according to them, like their city doesn't care. And so I thought it was really funny when Davy mentioned that in the intro, that they were writing that in 1980, that they wanted the building, the space of public housing to feel like someone cared. And now these women who have been twice displaced are feeling like their actual city, the entire city of Atlanta, does not care about their plight. And so I usually try to end on a high note, and I don't have one, but I'm happy to talk and think more about this.
Akira and Jill, thank you both so much for sharing your work and for offering to us a short version of projects that each of you has been thinking about for many, many, many years. And so it's really wonderful to get so many years of work in the room all at once, and to be able to think with you about these like very long-term projects that are just like so importantly and specifically about very large systems of power. And it's wonderful to hear you thinking about the specific geographies, the respective specific geographies that you're thinking about in ways that really make a set of systems of globalized racial capital tangible and evident through the parallels in your work. And Akira, thank you so much for drawing some of those out. I wanted to invite us to have a conversation now. And if you're watching on YouTube and want to submit a question, please go ahead and do so, and they'll transfer it over to us. But I wondered if we might start, Akira and Jill, by, I wanted to ask if either of you has questions for the other after hearing the other person's work. Is there anything that comes to mind as a way of framing a question that sets your work in conversation?
I have some. Do you have something, Akira?
I do have a question, but not being a poet, I'm like, is this an inappropriate question? I don't know. But I have like a super broad question. So I'm happy to, if you have like a narrower set, but I can also ask a good question.
Oh, I would love to ask you a question, if I could, about this, the word you said, agency, and you weren't sure what emotion would be necessarily attached to that. Agency is more like a state of being, or kind of a something that we would, like a sociality having agency. So I guess it's like a noun. But I guess, okay, so my question is about the women and others who want the state to do the right thing, intervene, or, you know, produce the kind of housing, or work with tenants to make, you know, housing work.
Mm-hmm.
Do the women you work with also have this sense of, okay, we're going to ask the state, and we also know that they're probably not going to come through? Mm-hmm. I mean, because one of the things that I was thinking a lot about in speech is this notion that's actually very kind of risky, but I was trying to go toward it, is what happens if we actually do relinquish the state from that third party, like, you know, yes, we will do X, Y, and Z for you. Do we lose a lot, or do we gain? Or, you know, and as modern subjects, can we even conceptualize that idea of a state that won't serve us? So I wondered if you could just talk about the women. And
yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's something, it's funny talking about like emotions and feelings, because I had a really hard time doing some earlier work identifying what emotions even were, just like listing them out. I was having like a really hard time because of these like really fine negotiations of what a feeling is. And so I think as it relates to agency, the context for for the first sort of set was very much under the, the state is the landlord for the housing authority, right? Like they committed in 1937 to provide this housing that was safe, sanitary, whatever, for low income persons. And so they have never like satisfied that on any basic level. And so there's this idea like, yes, like, do we need even the state to do this? Is this something? But at that point, it's like, you provided these opportunities and you provided this service to so many others before you got to us. And so they just wanted that basic, I'm a citizen. This is, and so like just never getting that citizenship was just very sort of frustrating. And I think now, the state is not the landlord. The state's not responsible for them at all. And they're like, why did that change? And like, I don't think I really actually agreed to that because like the problems are still here. There are people who are regularly experiencing homelessness as a result of like this total absence of public housing in Atlanta. And it's just, I cannot, they've taken away a lot of the homeless shelters and they've just sucked all of the social welfare out of the city. And I think that's wrong. Like, I don't know. I agree with them. Like, the state didn't do it right. They didn't do it perfect, but I would love to relinquish the state, but I feel so often that I've never been served by them. And so it's very sort of frustrating because yes, I guess perhaps my imagination is so limited that I'm like, no, but I still want those services. Like, I still believe that it's a good thing that you're providing housing or food or whatever. You should go back to that.
Yeah, I follow. I think it's really interesting in Abu Dhabi as a city, no one arrives in the city without a sponsorship from an employer and an arrangement for housing, basically. And what it's really struck me, the difference behind like the American idea of the city, it's just so filled with a rhetoric of, the American idea of the state, so filled with like promises deferred endlessly. And that's the difference. Is like, and that's my line is like in speech running throughout is Abu Dhabi is this place where you clearly see who is who and who will get what,
Deeply.
Right. There's no promise of other thing. Like it's a very, very clear sense of socioeconomic status is kind of like ingrained in it. And to a lot of American sensibilities, when they go to Abu Dhabi, they kind of think that's like a big violation of some sort. But on the other hand, I've seen it as a clarity that in a sense provides, in a weird way, like a relief or there is no hope for something else.
Yeah, what's what.
Yeah, and then the interesting thing is that diagonal is the shape of the mosque. It's what really brings people together. There's the city grid, and then all the mosques face Mecca, and it's on those grounds that people from different socioeconomic statuses come together, shoulder to shoulder, once a week, and sort of renew their purpose as to, well, why are we here in this city anyway? Like, we want a Muslim city that's safe to live in, even though we don't, there's no citizenship. So the citizenship is kind of like belonging to like a religion in a way. So I just thought I would offer that up as like,
wow,
the comparisons are, like you can't help but compare.
No, of course. And I'm like processing this, like the idea that, so you're just sort of living life and you're just like, this is okay. Like if you're there without that sort of accommodation, you're just tetherless.
I think people have the tether. It's kind of like what I was talking about, the fibril twisting, right? I was literally thinking of like internet, like like transfer of money, like remission, or like, what is it? Remittance, sending money home.
Yeah.
Is the tether, and then that home is being built like in Kerala, or the home is being built in the US, or it's some sort of, so everybody's kind of like connected to this other elsewhere as almost like a unifying. It's pretty weird.
I mean, I'm kind of into it though, because I do sort of understand that. Yeah, this is, I don't know. Am I taking this too far and thinking that this reminds me a little bit about the ways that Black women sort of went to northern suburbs to work for white families and couldn't really do anything in those communities and like had to come back home and kind of replicate the same thing. And so there was no, you know, they were working, but they were working knowing that they would never live in this neighborhood. Even if they had all the money in the world, they would have never, ever been in that neighborhood. And so I kind of see those tethers back of like trying to send that money back to the Northwest and creating that building and creating that space of belonging, but it never shored up because actually the state like refused to do basic infrastructure investment or like regular trash pickup or, you know, put public transit all the way out there. So even, you know, with that money and that work and that, you know, doing the things the citizens should do, they did that in spite, you know, knowing that they could never realistically achieve that. Yeah. Or maybe not, maybe that realism was not apparent at the time, or even still, that sort of mobility is not possible. I think that is, I don't know, like you said, like a very American thing. Maybe we're unable to think like that if we stop working, if we stop sort of, like you said, if we relinquish that and start thinking more radically about like what our purpose and role is and like what our service is to the state or our obligation is to the state, that could be useful.
I want to jump in and ask a follow-up to this question that draws to the surface something that I experience as being fundamental to each of your projects, and which has sort of been, for me, undergirding kind of the foundation of this conversation, which is I hear both of you thinking through affect as describing the terms of belonging and what it means to, and Jill, tell me how this is as a paraphrase of your question to Akira, but what it means to have a feeling of belonging that exceeds the state, even if you have a material relation to the state, to have a feeling of identification that is not primarily a feeling of identification to the state. And in both of your projects, that strikes me as importantly a form of gendered belonging. I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between thinking through the relationship between the legibility of affect and a form of feminized belonging. You are both thinking about the experiences of women or of coalitions of women. Mm-hmm. And while leaning into a really complex idea of affect as being something much more complicated than the way that it is often articulated as something that is feminized and therefore not important, you are both doing complicated and exciting work that's thinking complexly about feelings and complexly about gender, and specifically identification with the with coalitionality around womanhood. And I wanted to bring that gender dynamic to the surface and ask you to talk about how that shapes the terms of emotional belonging that each of you are thinking through as they exceed belonging to the state.
I'm going to try to answer the question. And I don't really know. I mean, I thought a lot about gender and emotion, right, in the city, because a lot of it is like fear and the other, and, you know, how do we make, I thought a lot about how do we make cities safe for women, and then like thinking about the complicated racial dynamics of that, how safety is much different for white women and Black women and who we sort of think should be safe. So certainly I saw that in the Atlanta child murders, this idea that not only were the children not worth kind of making as victims and protecting, but that also like the moms were kind of the cause of it by being negligent or too dependent on welfare or not watching their kids. Again, fully grown adults, like there was no oversight for the 21-year-old, right? So there's just, I do think that when, I mean, certainly how we think of emotions very broadly goes like right up against this idea of the rational planner and the rational city. And so the rational planner is like an engineer, no doubt, right? Definitely a man from the 50s, one era. And then like any sort of like, when you think of emotions in cities, people automatically go for the warm fuzzies, right? They're like, oh, belonging and like playfulness and happiness and joy. And there's, like you said, that optimism. And I think that emotions and even gender are just sort of totally sidelined in the planning conversation because they are one and the same, if that can make sense. But to me, like emotions are gendered and they are expressions of gender that are sort of reserved for certain constituents. Haven't really thought this out past that, but there is something, I keep running back into it whenever I start thinking about emotions in the city. Because people just stress the positive ones and then they have the fear and maybe anger, but no one ever talks about sadness in the city. People don't really talk about, you know, other more complex or less optimistic views of the city. And I wonder about that. I wonder why that is.
I was absorbing what you're saying. That yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. So thank you for that. Was interesting. Yeah, I really relate to this notion of poetry being a language that is, you know, and this is from Michel Desserteau, like that poetics, that a poetry that's like a counter text to the rational planner. You know, and I still teach that essay and I think about it a lot. Yeah, I was just trying to like remember Davy's question, coalitionality and gender. Coalitionality, is that the word you used? Okay, I'm sorry, it was just a very wonderful word. I don't know, you know, there are lines in my book that, you know, talk about like the refugee is always she. Yeah, and I come from a background where my father was a refugee. Just kind of thinking about like ways of seeing and knowing, and how often like a, you know, like a victim or perpetually unbelonging figure kind of serves the rest of us to belong, like by knowing like who doesn't belong. And I just think that that's extremely gendered. And I'm thinking of, but I'm thinking also of women and hosting. Working with Sandy Halal's work on the right to host. She's a Palestinian architect and visual artist, and this notion of the, you know, knowing in Sweden, Sandy Halal met a Swedish refugee, a Syrian refugee who got asylum in Sweden. And this Syrian refugee woman like claimed her space, made space in Sweden by opening up her home to host others once a week. And it was sort of that like claiming that right to host, like the right to gather, the right to like make knowledge, when you're supposed to be constantly like deferring your gratitude, your security, your, you know, you have found refuge in the state. You know, this Syrian refugee was really doing something else, like saying, I am here, and sort of turning the dynamic around by saying, and now I open up my home, a place where life does happen. And and I was sort of thinking about my experience, at least in Abu Dhabi, of sort of being slotted into that sort of perpetual visitor category for sure. Just, you know, my staying there is totally contingent on getting a new contract at my job. But it was when I saw that exhibition, Permanent Temporariness, at the NYUAD Gallery, and became familiar with Sandi Hilal's work, that I thought, like, well, why don't I host a salon in my home? And I didn't end up doing that, but I did end up starting a publishing collective. So it was a way to say, I am making things here. And I don't know if I can say anything about gender and that, but I think I would, the word domestic comes to mind, family space being like incredibly important. And I think of poetry as a language of like family and childhood, even, you know, like rhymes and those secret languages. So I think that's what I want to say about gender and belonging.
Those were both great answers and super interesting to be able to think about what each of you were hinting at as the expression of emotion as a relation to space and as a way of exceeding a kind of official or sanctioned way of being in space, as that excess is inherently gendered and inherently othering. And that's such an interesting thought. I'm going to have to think about that for several years and get back to you and see how it's going. As we've been thinking about it, something that I want to make sure I say is that as we've been thinking about this event for several years, that the idea of an event on feeling the city is an idea that appeared from first being in conversation with you, Akira, like 2 years ago. And so it's so useful to have been able to have thought about it for a long time. I want to close with one question from someone watching on YouTube, and I'll just read the question, which is, can you say more about the rupture trauma that COVID accentuates through structural inequality in cities like Atlanta and Philadelphia, or how affect pierces the temporality of definite present? And maybe we'll, bring it back to this moment of thinking about affect and cities and COVID in dialogue with this question.
Yeah, as far as COVID and the ruptures, it was like very obvious with housing, right? So shelter in place, everyone has to work from home, everyone has to school from home, et cetera, et cetera. We are now in Atlanta. I don't want to say we, they are down there who kind of working to prevent people from being evicted from extended stay motels because they've been in them for so long that they've actually become tenants. And so this idea that the housing crisis is imminent became apparent because of the shelter in place, right? The idea that you needed to be somewhere and preferably, away from other families, right? So we're returning to the nuclear family, we're sort of separating, we're dispersing. And so that can feel, again, those feelings of isolation. The second part of the question, affect, I definitely think the confinement has people thinking of futures and past and nostalgia. I've been getting all of these cereal ads talking about, don't you remember Saturday morning? And so, yes, I think certainly these sort of ruptures and traumas have us reminiscing for safe and stable past and wishing for even those safe and stable futures, which is kind of a little sad because, hopefully we'd have like a better transformative future, but I don't know if people can handle that at this point.
Jill, I wonder if I want to invite you to speak to this question about time and rupture and COVID. And then Akira, it looks like there's one more question about your work that I want to make sure we answer, and maybe so we'll close with that.
Sure.
Yeah, rupture, COVID. I'm really trying to study or absorb or check my own idea about individuation and individuality. Intellectually, I say I want to get underneath it, you know, and in my, maybe I also have like a feeling, an urge to get underneath it. And I just think that this time here, COVID in the US, we have a particular opportunity to sort of really see people's boundaries with, um, uh, you know, the way that they define their own boundaries and the way they will reject susceptibility, which is a term I really, really love from Robert Kochik, who's a really great architect and thinker and poet. So I've just been tuned into that. I think that this is a moment of rupture in terms of maybe putting immunity aside and thinking about susceptibility. And I just think it's interesting in the UAE, I did have to fly back to renew visa stuff and whatever, kind of ironically, in the midst of all this. And at the airport, I was asked to sign a paper that was in Arabic and then roughly translated that I understood that for the good of society, I would wear a mask and abide by all quarantine regulations. And I signed it. And I felt like, wow, you know, just even that phrase, like for the good of society, that's huge language, right? But I found it was actually very moving. And so that's yeah, it's interesting. I think that's all I'll say. It's just.
Thank you for that. That's super interesting. Akira, I'm going to pose this last audience question to you, which this person asks if you can talk a little bit about the complications of class in Atlanta, the city and suburbs' diverse Black communities in relation to this amazing population you put in on. I'm deeply curious about conflicted feelings of pride, betrayal, communal obligations, of thinking about conflicting affects.
Yeah, so Atlanta is interesting because it's one of the sort of like longest Black-led cities, like Black mayor, majority Black city council for quite some time, and a majority Black city. And there were lots of issues around class and even class and gender. One of my like last chapters in the book talks about how at the time that all of these public housing developments were coming down that were led by Black women predominantly. The city was led by a Black woman, Shirley Franklin. The Housing Authority was led by Renee Glover. The chief of police was a Black woman, Beverly Harvard, and the head of the public schools was a Black woman, Beverly Hall. And they all sort of worked to present this image of kind of how Black women can lead, and even kind of took on those sort of like, you know, maybe negative or positive maternal stereotypes of Black women, right? Like they were corralling the city to make it pliable for capital, right? So they took out the public housing, they took out the public schools, they took out a lot of the public goods and services that were used by Black women. And you see that now. There's a great Joe Biden ad with all 14 Black women mayors who are doing some interesting things in their city. I'll just stop there. Please vote.
Akira and Jill, thank you both so much for beginning this conversation now more than a year ago and being willing to bring it into the present, and for bringing the present along with it. It's been so wonderful to hear your work and to hear you in conversation, and it's just been a super pleasure to be in dialogue with both of you. So yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Davy, for organizing this. And yes, great to meet you, Akira, and hear about your work.
Thank you so much. This is really great. I'm so happy to have done this. So thank you so much, Davy, for organizing, and everyone for sort of making this happen, and people on YouTube.
Thanks for attending, everyone.